So I've been in IT, in software, in strategy, and operations. I've built 3 software businesses now, 2 within a company, and now the latest for myself, all right, in terms of the company. So that's the kind of like background on this. And also I'm fairly cynical about how you manage things, all right? So you'll find that coming through in a minute. So I wanted to start off with this slide to make the point. I show variations of this at different conferences. I actually hate the concept of mindset. And one of the things I want to drive out is the idea that there is an agile mindset or mental models, because both of them are really, really bad science. Yeah, and the trouble with mindset is it's used as an excuse. We had this wonderful agile program. We just spent $15 million on SAFe, and it's failed. And the reason is you guys didn't have the right mindset. Yeah, and that's the excuse, right? Now, the reality is, and this is the Everest point, you actually need sound process. You can't just rely on individual motivation. And I stand in leadership. You need to have processes which produce scalable and consistent results. And this is me coming from a complexity perspective. You stop trying to tell people what sort of people they should be, and you start to change the way they interact. And this is a key lesson from complexity science, is how people interact has a more profound effect than actually what they are in the first place. Anybody with teenage children knows this, because, when they hit puberty, you really need to worry about who their friends are, because that will determine the sort of person they are from the rest of their life. Humans beings are defined by their interactions. Yeah. So I want to argue here for process. I also want to argue for the fact we need to work with average people. There's a whole organizational development agile movement which wants to have exceptional people. Now, I do a lot of work in military environments, and they know they're not going to get exceptional people. So they have processes which make ordinary people exceptional when they work together. So to hold that thought, because I think that's one of the areas where agile needs to move, is stop trying to focus on making individuals brilliant and make people in combinations work in different ways. And again, that's more sustainable. It's actually more based on the science. The other big concept, and we're teaching a 2-day masterclass on this, and this is not me advertising because it's now sold out. Yeah. So this is what we're talking about rewilding. And remember, the rewilding concept in ecology is actually about rebalancing. It's not about returning to an original, it's getting a balance right. So the best way I want to illustrate this is kind of like one of the early canines. This is a timber wolf, still close to the original canines. It's highly resilient. You kind of like, there's lots of interesting things about wolf packs if you don't know them. So that's cool. The minute you domesticate them, you end up with this. What's interesting, when you domesticate something, within 7 generations, you get this huge apparent variety of highly inefficient species, which actually lack resilience. And if you want a metaphor for agile, that's a metaphor. Yeah, we started with a really cool idea, and now we've domesticated it. And we got lots of different things, none of which really work, but all of which claim they're different, and all of which have their fan club. So I'm going to come back to that later on in terms of an alternative approach. But I just want you to hold that concept and those images as you go. So the name for what I do is called sense making or naturalizing sense making. Whether you have a hyphen or not really matters. Sorry about this. This is the academic in me. If you have sense making as a single word, it's a noun. Sense making with a hyphen is a verb. Right? For me, the definition of sense making, which is key, is how do we make sense of the world so that we can act in it? Now, with that comes the concept of sufficiency. You never know everything that you need to know. So the issue is what type of things we can do on the state of our knowledge. And I'll make a general statement here, and I'll come back to some ideas on this in a minute. Part of the problem with agile is that agile people do not like users. You need to be honest about this, all right? Every agile method is designed to remove any interaction with users or force the users to appoint one person to represent them so that transactions are limited, right? I'll talk later about alternatives to this, right, in terms of the way it works. But fundamentally, we're actually designing systems based on for users who don't know what to ask for. Yeah, the capacity of technology nowadays to transcend the way that people work is huge, but users aren't aware of that. So trying to find ways we don't know enough to accept the input into a Scrum. Right, so I'm going to talk later about new methods or techniques which we've been working on to feed the backlog on Scrum. Yeah, most Agile goes wrong because not enough attention is paid to requirements. And fundamentally, people are working off a manufacturing framing. What they really want to do is please define what you want and we'll deliver it in the most efficient way. Nobody really thinks about the definition phase and about changing the way we think on that. And I'm going to argue for that and give you some methods or tools in a minute. The naturalizing in sense making comes from how do I use the natural sciences as a constraint? So my background, if you don't know it, is my degree was physics and philosophy as a joint honours. So that gives me a physicist's contempt for social scientists. I mean, none of them have enough data to ever form any valid conclusion in the first place. And if you move into the management field, then everybody works on best practices based on limited case studies. And in the Agile community, it's even worse because people develop whole methods on what I think worked for me the last time I did a project. And would you like a certificate in it, right? So one of the things we're going to start to look at is taking that more physics approach. So if you know the way physics research is done is you start with the mathematics and then you prove the practice. So you start with theory, then you see what works. Now that actually is a more novel technique because you tend to, the thing about theory-based is you explore possibilities you wouldn't otherwise do and you find novelty in the system. Right? So naturalizing approaches start with natural science as a constraint and then see what comes from that. So just to run through some of those to make the point here, and we're really trying to move away from this manufacturing metaphor. First is this little beastie, right? If you do anything on cognitive neuroscience, you will discover gorillas. There's actually a book called The Invisible Gorilla, which was written by the cognitive neuroscience community to counter Malcolm Gladwell's Blink. Yeah, never mention Blink to any person with a real scientific background and don't indicate you like it because it's the most appalling travesty of management thinking ever. I mean, this is a journalist who's got a theory and he picks aspects of cases which support the theory. The other book which does that, by the way, is Reinventing the Organisation, which has a religious thesis it wants to prove and it selects aspects of cases which support that thesis and it has no basis whatsoever in reality. Right? Sorry about that, but teal organizations are a waste of space. It's a waste of time. It's basically false data. And I will happily justify that if anybody wants to argue with me later. Right? It's also linked in with spiral dynamics, which is one of the established pseudosciences. If you don't know, the original research on pseudosciences is an American academic did limited experiments on students in his university, and from that extrapolated to a universal model for all cultures. Yeah, and that's Graves' work, and that's the basis of spiral dynamics. There's far too much of this within the field with people applying discipline. So yeah, that's a gorilla. So if you give radiologists a batch of X-rays, and on the final X-ray, you put a picture of a gorilla, which is 48 times the size of a cancer nodule, ask radiologists to scan through the X-rays and discover anomalies. 83% of radiologists will not identify the gorilla, even though their eyes physically scan it. The 70% who do come to believe they were wrong when they talk with the 83% who didn't. Now, that simple fact, which is called inattentional blindness, invalidates any approach based on systems analysis. We do not see what we do not expect to see. The most you scan of available data is between 3 and 5%. 5% if you're really focused. If you're Chinese, it doubles, and there's some interesting reasons around that and some consequences for the way they make decisions. Yeah, it's context object focus, this issue. But for everyone in this room, the most you'll scan is 3 to 5%. That then triggers a series of memory patterns. Now, this is where we don't like mental models because people assume that all memories are cognitive. They're not. A significant amount of memories are body-based, and an even more significant amount are socially based through the stories which create the company or the society we're in. what Andy Clark's called scaffolding. So consciousness is not co-located with the brain, it's a distributed function. So based on a partial beta scan, that triggers lots of memories, stories we've heard, experiences we've had, ideas we've got. This is happening in nanoseconds. We blend those together, called conceptual blending. And the first pattern which fits, we apply. So we do a first fit pattern match, not a best fit pattern match. We satisfy, we don't optimize. Now, in evolutionary terms, you can see why this happens. If you think about the early hominids on the savannas of Africa, something large and yellow with very sharp teeth runs towards you at high speed. Do you want to artistically scan all available data, look up a catalogue of the flora and fauna of the African veldt, and then look up best practices on how to avoid lions? You know, by that time, the only document, if any, used to be, will be the book of Jonah from the Old Testament, which is the only example I've found of a survivor's guide on how to escape from the digestive tract of a large carnivore. Yeah? We evolved to make decisions very, very quickly based on a partial data scan privilege in our most recent experiences. Yeah? Now, part of the problem is that agile people do that less than other people. So the more you move towards the autistic end of the spectrum, the more you actually scan more data and the more you're more logical. And that's actually part of the problem, because IT people design things for IT people, not for users, who are completely different. But even you guys will not see things you don't expect to see. So if you send out an analyst to interview people, guess what? And by the way, if you don't know it, once you conduct more than 2 or 3 interviews, you form a subconscious hypothesis. And literally, you only pay attention to things which match that hypothesis thereafter. So the good news is there's a lot out there waiting to be discovered. The bad news is we won't discover stories together which programmers can work with, because clusters of real experiences, what are called micronarratives, have more ambiguity in them, therefore they can adjust faster. If somebody's made them into story points, they've reduced the sophistication of reality into something which is easily coded. Right? So narrative is a key aspect of this, and it's also the way that we share knowledge and the way we work with weak signals and all sorts of other areas. And then we get on complexity, which is basically what the Cynefin framework is about. And a complex system is one which is deeply entangled. That's the best phrase. So there is no repeating relationship between cause and effect. The same thing won't happen again the same way twice. Now, one of the problems the Agile community has got is that complexity came in initially into Scrum through Stacy's matrix. And that basically says everything is complex. And you get into this, it's complex, therefore I don't have to exercise discipline. You know, we just do experimentation. And the misuse of the empirical world in Agile is huge. You know, I don't think anybody studied philosophy. Empiricism doesn't mean what worked for me last time and I'll see if it works again next time. Yeah, it actually is a much more disciplined approach. Yeah, so we now talk about theory-informed practice. Is you do things which are consistent with theory, and then you modify the practice, but all within that theory constraint. That's actually a lot safer and a more scalable. Yeah? So complexity is not an excuse not to have discipline. And you can see some of the pushback on this. You still have to do estimating, but you do estimating in different ways. Right? You still have to measure outcomes. Well, you have to measure a system, but you don't measure outcomes. You measure what are called vectors, direction of travel. The complexity requires actually far more discipline and order, because you're dealing with ambiguity and you have to manage things that you can manage and so on and so forth. But complexity is a key thing, because the only thing I know with absolute certainty about a complex adaptive system is whatever I will do will have unintended consequences. Now you know that, you're morally responsible. So what you have to do when you intervene in a complex system is assume that there will be unintended consequences, which is why what you do is you intervene in lots of small ways so that the unintended consequences can either be exploited if they're advantageous, because they often are, or they can be disrupted if they're not. You don't commit to very big projects. In fact, we're about to start some work with University College London on software project management and large public transport infrastructure management. And if you look at it, the general rule in software is any project more than is going to fail. Yeah, and one of the reasons is once you start to get that amount of stuff in system, you get so many interactions, the interactions increase geometrically that you can't predict the future, and you have to architect projects in a different way. We're currently starting work on a complexity-based extension to Prince2. So not rejecting structured project management, but saying in complex it needs to be different. And I want to emphasize this. This is where I think Knevin came into the agile movement through XP, interestingly not through Scrum. And it's more or less displaced Stacey now. But one of the values of Knevin is it says there's nothing wrong with order if you can create it. Not everything is complex. You need to do different things in different spaces. My famous statement is there's nothing wrong with waterfall. And I worked with Telstra, all right, in Australia. Nobody got promoted if they were on a waterfall project. So they invented 1 year sprints so that they could say they were being agile. I thought that was quite clever, really, all right, in terms of the way it works. There's nothing wrong with time boxes. Anybody remember time boxes? It was a key DSDM method. We now modified that. So you have a minimal viable product, a maximum viable product. You have a minimal level of resource and a maximum level of resource. And the team commit to deliver within those constraints on a date. Because in a multi-project environment, actually date delivery is more important than functionality because of the interdependencies. And that's one of the things which I think is wrong about Scrum. It basically says, wait until we've got it right, then we'll give it to you. And by the way, you can't use that in an application development environment because you've got users who scream if things don't go wrong and they don't want their complaint to be put on a backlog and dealt with in 3 weeks' time when the team's got experience. They want it dealt with now. No? So time boxes are actually very useful, and I'll talk about this later. One of the things we're now doing is saying take out the sprint from Scrum and replace it with a time box. Yeah, retrospectives work. So you can start, I'm starting to move into where I'm coming on this, which is multi-methods, multi-tools rather than single frameworks. Yeah. So to give you another couple of examples on this, and I said I'd give you some methods. One of the approaches we're now running is called entangled trios. This is part of the U Field Guide. So instead of sending out an analyst to interview people, because remember that won't work, we put together a group of threes. Yeah, a young, bright programmer who understands the latest technology, an older systems architect, or end system testers are quite good at this. So somebody who sees the whole system. So we put them together in a pair, together with a user trained to talk to IT people. It's a lot easier to train users to talk to IT people than train IT people to understand users. We're about to make those courses public, all right? They're quite easy. So instead of sending out systems analysts, we send out 15 trios to work on a problem for a couple of months part-time, see what they come back with. Or a couple of weeks if we're short cycle. And then all of them produce different ideas. Remember that some people have seen gorillas now? Yeah, and then we can integrate or synthesize those, and that feeds into a backlog. And even when we get into the backlog, we may have 2 or 3 competing teams where we got high levels of ambiguity. We don't go down one route. We have 2 or 3 routes working in parallel with different teams. That's one example. Another example is AAA. So this originally came from the work I was doing on joint application design. Anybody remember JAD? Okay, well, that's actually an indictment. This is a really effective method, all right? Came out of IBM in Canada. We took it up in DSDM. A JAD session is a highly intensive 1 or 2 day workshop in which you bring coders, architects, and users together. And the output is a series of prototypes. Yeah, it's far more effective than interviewing people because when you build prototypes in real time, people start saying, no, I really wanted this, all right? So that, and there's formal methods around this. It's worth revisiting. So we use JAD for everything. And we were doing big defense contracts. We were using it to bid. I even got to the point where we did best and final offers to clients in JAD sessions because we could interact with the client in different ways. Right? I can tell stories about that later if you want. Either way, so we were doing this intensively, and I just ran out of time to do all the sessions I needed to do for it was a $50-60 million defense bid. And so we had to get the definition right. So I ran out of time, so I decided to use time zones. So I said, we'll run a JAD session in Farnborough in the UK. We'll develop the initial output of a JAD, and then we'll send on the reuser requirement and the prototype to a team in Mumbai. and give them 8 hours on it. Then they'll pass it on to a team in San Jose, and they'll work on it, and it will come back to us the next morning. Now, that actually is a very effective technique anyway. You're using time differences to get variety into the system. But then one day I did it, and I forgot to send on the user requirement. I just sent on the output. And I woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning, realizing the error of my ways and thinking, oh my God, this is a disaster. Yeah, went in the next morning prepared to grovel and apologize to the client, to discover the client sat around the screen, which had just come back in from California, saying, oh my God, that's wonderful. Can we have that? We wouldn't have thought of it. And we've had that pattern ever since. So this is now called 888 or deliberate mutation, is you don't tell the two successive teams what the requirement was. You say, this is what we came up with. Can you improve it? You see what we're doing there? We're introducing variety into the system. Yeah, in short cycle iterations to improve the input or the variety which comes in to see gorillas. And then the final one, this is the complexity-based alternative to design thinking. And by the way, you know design thinking has come at the end of its life cycle when it gets put into the SAFe diagram. Yeah, I mean, that's one of the ways you know it's become a commodity, right? So one of the things we're working at there is unarticulated need mapping. So we put Gemba systems in place in a company by which users, every time they're frustrated or have an idea, they tell a story, they interpret it. We look at statistically significant clusters of those stories, and those become input into a Scrum backlog. Yeah, because one of the things we're trying to do there is users don't know what to ask for. So we take that, you build a prototype, and you go to the users and say, would this help? Now that starts to make you strategic, not a manufacturing unit, because you're finding ways to use technology for things people haven't yet asked for, but will make a real difference. And by the way, this is what Apple do all the time. Apple create beautiful things that you didn't realize you wanted till you've got them, and then you can't not have them anymore. Yeah, and that's actually called acceptation. It's a process of reusing stuff for different purposes in terms of the way it works. So I thought I'd give you those because, and this is building into the methods approach here, what we're starting to say is different organizations, different method kits apply in different ways. We're actually really good at complexity. There's no point in us spending time on ordered systems. Nothing wrong with Scrum. Scrum in Cynefin terms is a method of making complex things complicated, which is actually what you want to do. Yeah, because then they're stable and then they replicate. So linear iterations by definition do that. What we're doing is increasing the parallelism and the diversity of the input before you start a process like Scrum. And then varieties within Scrum, like changing a sprint into a time box, etc. So those are examples of this. And the basic factor about a complex adaptive system is that it's dispositional with propensities. It doesn't have causality. Now, I'll just explain that language. Disposition is rather like if you ever walked in alien territory and you've got a map. Yeah, there are hills, there are valleys, there are streams, there are marshes, there are bogs. Dispositionals is rather like that sort of map. This is what the system is like. So these things are going to be easier, these things will be more difficult. We now actually have fully developed that, by the way, taking constructor theory from quantum mechanics. And we have a method by which we can measure the energy gradients of a market or a company. Because whatever has the lowest energy gradient is going to happen. Yeah. So actually, if the energy cost of sin is lower than the energy cost of virtue, guess what? People will sin. Again, I can go through that later if you want. That's now operational. We've moved it from theory into practice, which, by the way, takes 3 to 5 years. Yeah, that's something the agile community hasn't got the discipline on. Is they throw methods together based on, well, we won't talk about the shallow approaches, but the shallow approach is, you know, I've read a couple of Wikipedia articles, I'll throw together a method and I'll sell you a certificate. Yeah, and that really is not sustainable. Yeah, I will tell you now from bitter experience, you are talking, once you've even got the theory right and the initial method working, it takes 3 to 5 years to get it to the point where it will genuinely scale. And anybody who tells you different from that is a charlatan and a stakeholder salesman, which is about 80% of agile. But sorry, I'm being a bit cynical here, but maybe it's 75%. I'm being unfair here, all right? So, and the things you can manage is this question of constraints and emergence in terms of the way it works. So those who want more on this, this is the EU field guide. Yeah. It's actually, you can download it for free. They'll also post you a hard copy for free. Yeah, if you live next to the English, as a result of which you're no longer considered European, you have to pay for the postage. Yeah, but you guys can get it for free, including the postage, right? It's really important because it's the first government endorsement of complexity science. There is no systems thinking in this. And please don't confuse systems thinking with complexity science. Yeah, the clue there is in the words. It's science, not thinking, right? They're very different and they have different origins, yeah, in terms of the way they work. Yeah. So again, that identifies three things you need to do to build a resilient organization. One is this concept of, remember I talked about Gemba with users? We're now deploying in one of the big pharmaceutical companies by which we got rid of all reporting. That's the plan. Right? And we're just starting this project. So instead of reporting, people keep continuous field records of experiences, ideas, encounters with leaders. What we want is that real-time feed. We originally did this with the US Army in Afghanistan. So basically, we said to company commanders, keep your field notes up to date. We don't require a patrol report. Same thing with Telecom Italia. You know, at Salesforce, you don't have to write sales reports anymore, provided you tell stories and explain experiences as they happen. So this concept is you need to use your employees as a sensor network. So I can now present a problem to, say, 1,000 people. They look at the interpretations, which means I can find the outliers and I can see the patterns. Right? So that concept of a human sensor network is key. And we're doing work at population level, for example, by using school children as ethnographers into their communities to gather data in real time so that we can actually test responses. And next time we have a lockdown, and by the way, there are going to be more lockdowns. You think COVID was bad, you've got no idea what's coming from the bacteria thawing out in Siberia at the moment. Yeah, and bacterial plagues are far worse than viral plagues if you look at human history. So one of the things we're starting to do is how do we build networks which we can get immediate feedback so we can work out where to lock down and where not to based on measuring human sensitivity. So this is like serious shit as well as the sort of agile stuff in terms of the way it works. Informal networks. That method I said, user together with 2 IT people, run that every 3 to 4 months, including looking at the whole DevOps issue. Yeah, so you can do that. Constantly change the trios. Within 2 years, everybody is within 3 degrees of separation of everybody else. And informal networks are far more trusted than formal systems. Yeah, so designing and building informal networks is key. If you want another example on this, the Singapore government is really good at this, and they're a very successful country, right? One of the reasons is everybody goes through national service. So regardless of their educational background, they're in the army. Yeah, and they have to go back for refresher courses for some time afterwards. So their networks are dense. All right, they go across silos and not linked to educational backgrounds. In the UK, in contrast, the elite go to 3 private schools, yeah, and 2 elite universities. So the networks don't spread wide enough, so they're quite perverse. Yeah, so that issue about how do you create informal networks, and it's a measure of corporate effectiveness. Also, from an IT department point of view, if you've got informal networks which spread across the user community, you can resolve problems very quickly. And this is an architectural issue, is design those informal networks. And the final thing is map what you know at the right level of granularity. If you look at the history of our industry, it's actually based on what we call radical repurposing or acceptation. IBM was a worldwide market leader in punch card machines. So IBM had spent 30, 40 years working out how to build machines that can actually read punch cards. Yeah, and it's kind of like it didn't carry forward into the American election, but that's another matter. We won't talk about Chads. IBM was really good at doing that sort of stuff. So when the computers came along, they repurposed that skill to create early dominance of computer programming. Right? That actually is a key issue. Innovation happens when you repurpose something you're already good at for something completely novel. A Raytheon engineer, noticing a chocolate bar melted in his pocket, realized the significance, put a metal box around the magneto. We got microwave ovens. You look at the history of human innovation, it's all about repurposing existing capabilities for something novel. Now, this is called exaptive innovation. Yeah. Now, I'll give you an example on this, and this is a project I'm ashamed of in terms of its consequence, but the delivery was brilliant. We were working with one of the European lighting companies, and they had this idea that lights could be used as a garden feature, not just to light the garden. Any gardeners here? Okay, I suffer my annual penance is I have to go to the Chelsea Flower Show. I absolutely hate this. I'm not a gardener, but I've now decided if I go as an anthropologist, it's okay because the people are really interesting, all right? So I now have the telephoto camera taking pictures of people, and I get into trouble for that. But basically, you go to a modern garden and lights are part of the garden. Now, that's fairly new, and it came out of this project. So what we did is we pulled in 3,000 or 4,000 stories from people across Europe about their gardens, what they liked and what they disliked. We didn't ask questions about light. We hid things about light and shade in the way they interpreted their stories. Yeah. And then we took all of the technical capabilities and we got the engineers to interpret their technical capability into the same indexing structure. Different languages, it was polymorphic, so it was different language, same concept. And we mashed the databases together. And we had 5 statistically significant clusters. So we went to marketing and said, why are these user stories linked with these core technologies? And 2 of them became major businesses. The one I'm ashamed of is there is actually a plastic rock you can buy which changes lurid fluorescent colors based on human proximity within water features. It's truly horrendous, but it's selling really well in Southeast Asia. It is entirely based on a technology originally developed to handle urine-saturated staircases in Eindhoven football stadium. Yeah. Now, that's what we need to start to think about as IT people. How do we find things in the company that we're good at, and how do we use technology to associate them with new problems? And again, this is about becoming strategic, not operational. Then you can make a difference. So those are 3 things within the field guide which are recommended. What I now want to do, finish off, is just, I can do a lot more on this if you want, but what I really want to do is to move on to this. This is a key principle. I remember when I first ever saw SAFE, and I'm sorry if there are people who've had to go through SAFE certifications. I realize you need to be worked. You know, it's kind of, there's all sorts of things we have to do as human beings, which we know are wrong. So I accept that. All right. You can apologize later. First time I ever saw the SAFE diagram was at an agile conference in Novi Sad. I've never forgotten it. I wrote a blog post in anger within the next 5 minutes, which was called The Infantilization of Management, which is still current and still highly referenced. All right. But I remember looking at it and saying, it's wrong a priori. You can't scale a complex system by imitation and aggregation. You scale a complex system by decomposition and recombination. It's rather like DNA. Yeah, from 4 basic chemicals, the whole of organic life form comes. If you scale things which are already aggregates, you lose capability. Yeah, so the key thing in complexity is you descale to the lowest level of coherent granularity, and then you allow recombination. So that's, 101 science in that respect. So that's a key principle. Now, once you get that, you start to look at different ways of working. So the first thing is, the last thing we need is a new approach to Agile, or a new Agile framework. And everybody's trying to do this. You've got Agile 2. You've got Amplio, God help us, all right? You've got Jürgen Apollo's latest little creation, which is a revert of Spotify. Everybody's trying to create a proprietary approach, when that's the last thing we need, because any proprietary approach is limited to the imagination, the scope, and the background of the people who created it. So different groups of people can create different things. And by the way, you can't adopt the Spotify model because Spotify is an emergent process. Yeah, you can't copy the output of an evolutionary process. You have to replicate the starting conditions, as anybody in Spotify will tell you. So this is kind of like where we worked, and we realized if we did it, we needed to do like we did with the SDM. We needed to make this multi-vendor. So a couple of things on this. We need to focus on practical tools and techniques which can be combined in different ways. Yeah, again, trying to move away from single frameworks into something which is actually much more fluid in terms of the way it works. I'm using two phrases there. Fractal means self-similar. Holographic, if you break a hologram, you can see the whole picture in every shard. And those are two really important concepts in terms of modern software development. Every situation will be different. We get stability in the components, but then uniqueness in the assembly. And again, if you look at nature, basically as things come together in different combinations, the number of permutations becomes near infinite. All right, so you've got contextual adaptability with a degree of coherence. We need the processes to be open source with community involvement. We can't afford a proprietary approach anymore. Not in the whole. That's actually kind of dangerous. Different practices, people need to choose what works for them and actually build things over time. So this is kind of like the approach. So we've been doing this for some time. I originally developed this in IBM. If you actually brainstorm with hexes, people put them together in novel combinations. If you give people playing cards or squares or circles, they put them into categories. Hexagons are interesting because people combine them. So on the left, you've got the hexes we produced. They've got our brand on them because there are methods and our tools. On the back of those hexes, so there's a short description on the front. On the back, there's a longer description, and there's a QR code which takes you to our open source wiki. So the whole principle is you can actually use those in a sense. What we're now doing, in the initial work we've done is with Ivar Jakobsen on Essence, but we're going to work with the other Scrum groups as well, is we're now taking, this is Scrum, decomposing Scrum into its unit components, the lowest coherent level. You can see our methods there in Tangled Trios and AAA. You'll also notice that they also have this fairly complex symbol sets which basically talk about cost and resources, facilitation skills, in terms of the way it works. Now, this we launched last week preliminarily in Lisbon, was now starting to talk about it. The major launch will be at the Agnostic Agile Conference, which is coming up. I've been working with Ivor on that, right? What we've done is we've created an open source standard by which anybody can produce hexes which will work with the other hexes. And we've also created a production facility which, if you have an idea, somebody else will produce them for you. Now, that's actually really important. And we're also making sure that they have a different brand. So this is an example of them in practice. This is one of the experiments. People playing around, putting things in different combination. Hexes add as memory devices. So if you go on a course, you only remember one thing or two things from the course. Here you lay out all the methods you use on the course, and then it acts as a memory device, so you pick them up and use them, in terms of the way it works. And I say we're producing hexes for all of those sort of different things, values, principles. Comic Agile are producing an agile set of cartoons for this. So a gaping void, we're creating disruptive components. And that actually is the brand. It's deliberately not branded for the Canadian company. So basically, we've created an independent brand, and then everybody's methods can have their own brand, and the QR code will link to their own site. And so the principle is, for example, if you're in a SAFe implementation, well, you've probably only used bits and pieces of SAFe, and they all came from somewhere else anyway. So you start off by laying out, these are the things we did. This is working, this isn't working, we need to add to that. Or if you're starting a project from scratch, you say, we'll do these things in sequence. And we actually have overlays on this. So you can say, when we reach that point, we'll stop and look again and so on. So the whole principle about here, and we got huge take-up on this. I'm really excited because it's kind of like right time, right place, is any agile method vendor, including any company who's produced a novel method, can now actually send something in to be part of the kit. And it's sold in packs. And so people can now start to put together different components from different vendors in different ways. So that's kind of like what we've now put together. And our pledge is we're managing it for the moment with partners, but it will go into open source membership within 5 years. And that's actually a legal commitment we're going to make on this. So I thought I'd finish off with that, because that is me trying to get back to what I call the heart. I can't say the heart of Agile because that's Alistair's phrase. But that rewilding concept, we need to get back to the point where we have a way of doing good things in standard ways, but introducing novel things, and where the novelty comes from the assembly, not from the framework. And the assemblies are unique to individual contexts. Okay, so I went slightly over what I planned, so apologies for that. But people carried on paying attention, which is always dangerous. Yeah. So anybody, questions, comments, arguments, anything anybody wants to bring in place? Or are we all going to be silent and people want more drinks? All quiet?
I'm interested in, you have the concept of liminality in Knevin.
Yeah.
What do you say is an important thing to look at to know when to change from one domain to the other?
Yeah. Okay, so let me draw that and explain it. Yeah. So if you take Knevin is like that. Yeah. This domain, by the way, is now significant. It's been renamed Aperia. So Knevin, after 15 years, is now when it's. And by the way, it takes that long, to really create a framework. You've got you've got contradictions. You explore it. Now the liminality looks like this. So I have this domain here, which is transition between complex and complicated. That's where Scrum works really well, because it goes through linear iteration based on a near final definition. Yeah. Work we've done like 888, fits here, feeds in. So we're not saying our methods would work over there. Yeah. This here is asking, that's where you need this mass participation. So I don't know what all the hypotheses are. I need to present something to a lot of people and get multiple feedbacks and see what comes out of it. That's that liminal area to chaos. This area here is actually quite interesting. This is an accident, all right? Every time I drew this, I couldn't draw it so that there wasn't an inclusion in complicated. And I finally gave up and drew it that way. And then when we did the EU field guide, I realized that's actually valuable. That's the domain where experts disagree. Yeah, and we developed a method for that called the triopticon. You can look at that on the website. It's got simulations. So again, that's liminality. You can't decide what the experts have done. You've got to have a way of a structured dance between them. And then the final resolution, by the way, is separating the central domain of Knevin into aporetic and confused. So confused is bad. Aporetic, I'm quite proud of this. I've actually managed to get a term from Derrida's philosophy into American management speak, all right? This is a major achievement, all right? Nobody's done it before, yeah? So I've got high credibility in continental philosophy, but British philosophy doesn't think Derrida is a philosopher anyway, because they don't understand him. Aporetic is a key concept in Derrida. He basically says if you know the answer to a question, it isn't a question, it's a process. If aporia is a question to which you cannot answer it until you've thought differently about the problem. And that's the central domain of Knevin. If used properly, you move into that. And we actually have 5 physical, 5 linguistic, 5 aesthetic aporia methods, which put people into a position where they can't carry on thinking the way they thought before. And it's the process which forces people to think differently. Yeah, people will not think differently in their stress. So that's liminality in Knevin. That was important. Yeah. That answer the question?
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Cool. Any more? We can just break and go for more drinks. That's fine by me. Okay, so if anybody's interested in the Hexi concept, please get in touch, right? As I say, we're now building the number of vendors who are putting, the XP community have bought in, Agnostic Agile have, the DevOps consortium have bought in. I think it's right time, right place. The only people who don't like it, I think, and we're saying to SAFE, please put any original methods you've got into the framework, or put your versions of Scrum. That's okay. Because the whole idea on this is nobody is allowed to say what's right or wrong. Anybody can create it in a format, and then what's right or wrong will emerge as people practice. Okay, thank you very much for your time.